Great, so we've gone over a lot of the features and capabilities within the curves adjustment. So let's look at some live sort of examples of what you can do and common uses for it, such as creating vignettes, or creating a little bit of different in iFlow, or separation, or more fill light, where you can really customize and utilize the maximum features such as masks and such as playing with blending modes and opacity. So let's look at some of those. So in this example, what am I calling this? Forest Edge, Nature Child, whatever you want to call this here. Let's look at the three different curves I put on here. And by the way, doing just one curves isn't always enough, right? Sometimes you want to curves for one spot to do one thing. Often I'll have many, depending on what it is. If it's a composite, I'll have curves on a whole bunch of different things. But for this, let's take a look at this right here. All right, so there's sort of the base image, if you will. In this first one, let's look at what I did. I highlighted just those bits there. So let's look at the curves for this. This is where I created two control points, one for sort of this dark gray right here, and it looks like it's been boosted up from about here all the way up to here. So those darks are boosted just in that one area. And then finally, I did a little bit of the highlights for that as well to boost that up. And specifically, let's delete this. Actually, let's take off the visibility and do a new version of that. So if I have this, looking at this curves adjustment here in my histogram, this is where you have to do a little bit of sort of pre-visualization and pre-masking with your mind and imagination. So if I only want to edit that grass to make it pop a little bit more, to have a little more separation or depth, this is where I can just look in that area. Because when I start playing with this curves, it's going to blow out everything and change everything, but I know that I'm going to mask it and make it so it only affects just the areas that I want. So it's good to have that in mind before you start even editing with various masks and curves adjustments. So looking at this one, I took those darks and I boosted them up a little bit. So I'm just looking here. I can see that this is getting blown out. There's some other things happening. All right, so I'm just looking at that area, and let's do it right about there. And I'm also going to add another point right here, just to make that pop and have a bit more contrast in there. So those darks are still staying pretty dark, but those lighter darks are a little bit lighter, all right? So that's where the contrast is. And then the more gentle you can keep this curve, the less sort of crazy it's gonna be. Again, just an example of inversion, this is when you're saying lights are darker. This is what you want to avoid. So with curves, less is more, right? Again, we can always pull back the opacity and paint things in. So if you overdo something, just be prepared and know it's okay to pull back just for a little bit of adjustments. Small adjustments have a really big impact. It doesn't take much. So this is overpowering, but it's a good example. So if I want this to only be in one spot, again, with a mask, white reveals. Right now it's revealing everything that we just did with this curves adjustment. If I want to conceal it, I can do Command-I to invert that. Another way, well, there's a few different ways you can do that, but that's a very quick way to do it. You could spill with black. You can hold down Option when you're creating a new adjustment. Let's see if that works. And you can tell it what to start with there. So right now with a black mask, we see nothing of this curves adjustment, right? It's invisible. It's hidden away. So if I had in mind that I wanted to paint it in just some areas, I can then do that. So if I hit B for my brush tool, and I come over and make sure you're painting on the mask. This is a very common thing with over in your layers panel. You can select the object, which you can't paint on the actual properties of the curve, or you can select the mask. So always pay attention to that you are painting on the mask, especially if you have actual layer pixel content that's on there. In this case, we're fine and good, but it's something to be aware of. B for brush. I want to paint with white to reveal, right? White reveals, black conceals. And I want to paint with, let's do 30% opacity. I'm going to hit 3 on the keyboard. And I don't need this open here. 3 on the keyboard, and that's going to bring me to 30% opacity up in the options bar. So from there, then I can just start painting. I can do this with my mouse or anything else, and I can paint in specifically where I want those curves to be, right? Where I want it to be a little bit of highlight. Always use a really soft brush. A big gotcha is when people start using really hard brushes and you just see that terrible line. You can see exactly how things were edited. So right now I have hardness all the way down to 0 and I'm using a nice soft and fuzzy brush here. So I'm just kind of painting happy little bushes. Channel your inner Bob Ross at this point and make happy little mistakes here and there. My wife just put on a really interesting episode of Bob Ross, and it's like, oh, it's so calming, it's meditative. So this is where you can really play with it and almost getting sort of a painterly aesthetic of what you're doing. So let's take a look at the before and after of there. So when I was doing it, it didn't look like much, but wow, that really brought out a lot with that grass and also a little bit on that subject. You want to be careful around the edges because you'll start creating sort of halos and highlights and things that will be a tale saying, wow, this has really been edited. One way to do it, again, is make sure you have a soft brush, and that will sort of mask those changes. It will make it so it's not as abrupt there. Okay, so there's a little bit more dimension. And let's say I want some of that to be up in these trees as well. I can paint that wherever I want it to bring out some of that detail. All right, and let's say I want to do something for the sky, and I want to make that even more dramatic. So I'm going to do another curves adjustment, just looking at the sky. I'm going to crush some of those. Let's see what we get with that. All right, but I still want some of those highlights. So I'm going to come over here with these mids, and I want those highlights to be nice and bright. There we go. So I just manually did that. Again, I can use this feature and click and drag, right? And actually, let's do it that other way so we can see it. So to delete control points, I can command click them if you're on a Mac, control click them if you're on a PC, and I'm going to click here and click here. That way I have my 2 points there. If I come over to this one, it knows, right, it's going to select that one. If I come over here and I start dragging, it's not going to create a new control point right next to it. It knows, oh, you mean to select just that one there. So I can darken that down. I'm ignoring the grass and just looking at that. So I'm dragging straight down on the image right here on this blue to darken that down. I'm going to come over here to this lighter part, and I'm going to drag that up a little bit. Let's increase the contrast that way. So it's a bit heavy, to say the least, of an adjustment. So let's pull that back and play with it. One way we can do that is just with the opacity, right? But I like to paint things in. So I'm going to invert this and hit B. And you could just spend hours, even days, just sort of playing and putzing around and literally sort of becoming a photographer painter, painting in different parts and getting different looks here. So I'm just going to paint this in a bit more with this and get that nice and dramatic. Okay, so this is the idea where you can really customize different parts of your image. So for the really impactful and very dynamic landscapes that you see from a lot of professionals, this is a huge part of what they're doing, where they're looking at different areas and customizing each part and doing a curves adjustment that's really maximized for that specific area, or that object or subject or building, right? And you can do so much with playing with those control points. And if you ever find out, you walk away and come back and you go, whoa, that's way too much, you can always pull back the opacity with that layer. It's great. Another thing to play with, if you double click on the layer's properties, you have the density. So if you want it to apply everywhere just a little bit, this is where you can bring back the density of that mask, right? See how it's turning into more of a gray? So just another little tip and something else to play with. Also, let's say you did brush with a really hard edge and you missed perhaps an edge to this, you can also play with feathers. So the properties panel for curves, whatever has a mask, can be a really helpful way to seamlessly get things in without making it look, oh, that's been edited, right? As little gotchas and tells as possible. So let's take a look at what I did. Another common use is creating vignettes, right? This is you don't have to do it this way, but this is one use for it. This is where I took this adjustment and just darkened everything down, and we can see I inverted it again, so it was all black, and then we can tell that I just painted in with white along those edges, and this is going to just darken around those specific points there. So if we add all those together, I think it was just those two, and then finally one for color. And let's take a look at what that one is. So one thing I noticed, even though I created more contrast, that I was changing my blending mode on this one, right, which sort of brought more out there, and changed it to luminosity. So that intentionally didn't play with a color, and that allows me to play with a color afterwards a little bit more. So another blending mode to play with is one called color, and this will make it so it will only affect the color. So it's basically the exact opposite effect of what luminosity was doing. So luminosity only let us change the lights and darks, the values. When we shift the blending mode from normal, which is up here, to color, whatever I do with this adjustment, whatever effect would be had by increasing the contrast is just going to change the color and not change, this is kind of interesting, and not change any of the other values that we see. So if I want to saturate it, right, I can do it this way. Or if I wanted to go into individual channels, right? I can do that this way, and that's only going to control the color and not the contrast or brightness. So those are some ways in which you can use curves to do sort of common things for adjusting different parts of an image. It's also really important to start using it and thinking of eye flow and hierarchy, right? So if go back to that one of the first images that we're looking at, this one, for example, when I first shot it, again, it was super dark. I was shooting into the sun. I knew afterwards that I can bring in some fill light, and that's what curves is really especially great for. You can paint in the right values for whatever part you want. So here's that sort of the final one, brightened everything up. I was okay with sort of making that spot too bright. I wanted there to be a flow between my ridiculous face, the sun, and sort of leading us around here, and then also a slight vignette just to make sure that we're brought back around, right? There's sort of a balance and flow between all the different components. Humans are a lot like moths. We see light and we just kind of go to it with our eyes, right? We're drawn to faces and light. That's just a fact. So how do you use that with adjustments like curves? So this is where I can, that's just for color there, create a new curves adjustment. And this is where you sort of mentally mask things out ahead of time. I know that I want that face, the ridiculous face, to be a bit brighter, because we want to be able to see it. So I'm going to boost this up, but I still want there to be contrast. So therefore, I'm going to come over here to the dark section and just click down. Again, you can do it with this tool directly on the image, but this is where you can finesse it. And actually, I will finesse it by hitting the up and down arrow keys and getting it just right. Okay, who knows what just right is? Very subjective sort of thing, but I'm going to say that's perfect there. So everything else, it made it too light, too much contrast. I don't like it all over the place, so I'm going to hit Command-I, or Control-I if you're on a PC, hit B for my brush tool, come over here and paint with white. If you ever have black selected, just hit X. Then I'm going to paint again with 30% opacity. That's just fine. I'm going to paint this in. And look at that. So it just brings out whatever I want. So if this is the most important part, it needs to be lighter, right? It needs to have that hierarchy where it's getting our eye's attention. And similarly with his face. I don't want it to be too flat or washed out, but it definitely needs to pop more than it is. So the more you work with a soft brush, you can work this in sort of a subtlety. And so I'll just make that sort of a funny, I like that red there. And what's nice, once you have that set up, you can always adjust it afterwards if you need more, right? See how it's only affecting that area? So really awesome sort of play with just getting it the way you want. And then finally, you can do a curves adjustment that's more of a global adjustment. Those are more sort of localized. This is where you can start really making sure it's just on those certain parts there. Let's see. Let's say we want everything to be just a bit brighter. All right, there we go. So now it's really popping. That's a different look than what we had before, but you can see, again, even without having a fill light, you can really bring it in together. And there's the final one. Looks like I added more of a vignette, darkened it down, just like we showed before. So controlling eye flow, really important. Curves is huge for doing so many just very common things and also really technical things such as controlling color. So one last thing that I'll show is how to bring it into perhaps a composite when you need things to sink in perfectly together and how you can make that seamless in just one edit, right? One curves adjustment. So look at that, and then from there, you can take it wherever you want. It's a fun one to play with. So let's jump into that next section.